Now, before I start this video, I want to be clear this video is not to promote any sort of prejudice or hatred of any ethno-religious group or any ethnic group or any racial group or anything like that. This is being provided merely for educational purposes. And what you need to understand about social justice is social justice in its original form was primarily about economic justice and agricultural justice and things of that nature, which had to do with all people regardless of race, ethnicity, etc. The first time you really see race being involved in social justice is honestly the National Socialist Party of Germany and their concept of Völkisch equality. But everywhere else where you see social justice applied, now Völkisch equality in National Socialist Germany is the same thing as social justice in every other political framework, be it communism, be it justicialism. In fact, justicialism, which is sometimes known as Argentine National Socialism or Argentine Fascism, and has been referred to as both by its founder, Juan Perón, as both Argentine Fascism, saying it was essentially the application of Mussolini-style fascism to Argentine problems, and later he had referred to it in his autobiography as essentially National Socialism. Okay, but in Argentina, social justice, which justicialism essentially is social justice, and as Juan Perón said, the two arms of justicialism are social justice and social help, and with those two arms they give the people of Argentina a supportive hug, essentially. So the thing is, that does not apply to race in Argentina, despite it being referred to as both Argentine fascism and Argentine National Socialism. So the only place, or the first place, that it's referred to in effect of race has to do with National Socialist Germany. And then, of course, with because you have to remember, for example, in the Soviet Union, social justice was applied, but not in respect to race, as they did not consider race to be a thing. The same is true in fascist Italy. Okay? It was more so a nationalistic thing, less so a racialistic thing. Mussolini is known to say things such as, National Socialism is for blonde people. Okay? So, a history of Jews and social justice. Okay? And the reason I'm putting this out is people might be wondering, well, where did the modern concepts of social justice being applied to race, ethnicity, ethnicity, sexual orientation, body size, like fat acceptance and things like that, religion, all this crap. When did social justice get applied to this? Well, it so happens mostly in Germany, again, with what was called the Frankfurt School of Sociological Research, and after that was shut down when the National Socialist Workers' Party took control, it was then later moved to the United States as the New School for Sociological Research, which is where feminism and fat acceptance and a lot of these other issues, or a lot of these other applications of social justice, because you have to remember, in the United States, social justice was primarily a Christian thing. It was predominated by people like the Quakers and the Seventh-day Adventists and people like that, and some of the Protestant sects, which were opposed to slavery, things like that. But that was not a racial thing. That was like the USSR. It was stating that these people should have the same rights regardless of their race, not because of their race. Okay? So that's the thing. You got to look at it that way. Now, with things like affirmative action, where it's causing special treatment in the name of social justice, and these things, these all spawn forth from this ideology. Social justice as, for example, like what Black Lives Matter does with the critical race theory, that also comes from these concepts. So, a history of the Jewish people and social justice. This course explores these. Now, I want to be sure that you understand this is not going in deep into explanation, but this is a course at University of Michigan. So, this course explores the striking profile of Jewish engagement in social movements, including labor, civil rights, and feminism, that have shaped 20th and 21st century American society. It examines these movements and how changing constructions of Jewish identity oriented American Jews towards questions of social justice and social justice in American society. Note that it states in American society. That's importante moving forward. Now again, I want to be very clear that this video is not to cause any sort of hatred or anything towards any specific ethnic group or ethno-religious group or any sort of, race, okay? So, let's take a look here. So, American Jews in politics. In United States politics, Jews have changed political positions multiple times. Many early American German Jewish immigrants to the United States tended to be politically conservative, but the wave of Eastern European Jews, starting in the early 1880s, were generally more liberal or left-wing, and eventually became the political majority. Many of the latter moved to America, having had experience in the socialist, anarchist, and communist movements as well. So you have to remember, this is where they had their experience, was in socialist, anarchist, and communist movements, as well as the Laborbund, which would be like the labor group. Emanating from Eastern Europe, many Jews rose to leadership positions in early 20th century American labor movement and founded unions that played a major role in left-wing politics inside the Democratic Party politics. For most of the 20th century, since 1936, the vast majority of Jews in the United States have been aligned with the Democratic Party. During the 20th and 21st centuries, the Republican Party has launched initiatives to persuade American Jews to support their political policies, with relatively little success. Over the past century, Jews in Europe and the Americas have traditionally tended towards the political left and played key roles in the birth of the labor movement as well as socialism. While diaspora Jews have also been represented in the conservative side of the political spectrum. Even politically conservative Jews in Northern America and Western Europe have tended to support pluralism, or the positions associated with cosmopolitanism. Now, for people that don't know what cosmopolitanism is, because they don't teach anything in school, we're going to go over that right now so you can understand what that is. Cosmopolitanism is the idea that all human beings are members of a single community. Its adherents are known as cosmopolitan or cosmopolite. Now, this has to do with a lot of the what I would call dangerous shifts in American conservatism. And this has been done by the neocons, the neoconservatives, which are, of course, highly Zionist. And again, I'm not judging Zionism as good or bad. Right now, I'm just talking about it indifferently, okay? But what I will say is Zionism is Israeli nationalism. Zionism is ethnic nationalism, okay? So the thing is, what you have to understand, though, is to get more conservative Jewish people into the Republican Party, the Republican sphere, a lot of the, how would you say this, neoconservatives, particularly the evangelical Christians, who also share a similar view that humanity is just a common grouping of people with no differences. This is what I like to call magic dirt conservatism, which is the idea that you can take anybody from anywhere, plop them in the United States, and they will be the torchbearers of the Founding Fathers, regardless of their biological composition. And this comes mostly from this idea of cosmopolitanism. Okay, now I think that there's plenty of room for people with a cosmopolitan idea. Okay, so the idea encompasses different dimensions and avenues of community, such as promoting universal moral standards, establishing global political structures, or developing a platform for mutual cultural expression and tolerance. For example, Kwame Anthony Appiah articulates a cosmopolitan community where individuals from varying locations, physical, economic, etc., enter relationships of mutual respect despite their differing beliefs, religious, political, etc. By comparison, Immanuel Kant envisioned a cosmopolitan world where armies were abolished and humans were governed under a representative global institution. In all instances, proponents of cosmopolitanism share an emphasis that all humans should form one cohesive and united community. In a looser but related sense, cosmopolitan is also used to describe places where people of various ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds live together and interact with each other. Okay? Now, as people know, I am not against the World Economic Forum. I am not against the United Nations. However, I think there are better ways to apply some of the ideas of the United Nations. But I think overall, the overarching themes of both the United Nations and the World Economic Forum are positive for the human species. And I do believe the human species is a species of varying people that should work together. However, I differ on to what level that needs to be. Because I still am, of course, a strict U.S. nationalist as well as a Pan-American. So I am a nationalist, a civil nationalist, a U.S. civil nationalist, as well as a regional, I don't want to say nationalist because that would not make sense, but I'm a regional internationalist and do see a role for a global government to help protect the human species as a whole, especially with things that are threats to the entire human species, such as collisions with extraterrestrial, crap like comets and asteroids and things like that. I think, honestly, that should be the prime focus of every space agency, is to work together to protect the Earth from an extraterrestrial collision with a comet or an asteroid or something of that nature, as well as to protect the human species from various diseases and things of that nature. Okay, going back here. So, more consistently than many other elements of the political right. So, Jewish conservatives tend to be more supportive of cosmopolitanism than other aspects of the political right, although I would not agree with that. I would say currently you have two, and they are also neocons, but I would call them the evangelical right, who is neocon at this point. They are no longer paleo-conservative or anything of that sort. I have many paleo-conservative values, but I do believe that there is a very good place for people with these values. I am also simultaneously progressive with my concepts of applying science to the governance of the country and of everything, okay? But what you need to understand is the evangelicals and such, they are no longer paleo-conservative or even conservative. Most of them are essentially liberal, and they are cosmopolitan in nature. The other area you have are people that embrace libertarian conservatives, and they are also very, very cosmopolitan in nature. And the thing is with the libertarians is they have a very bizarre idea that the market will regulate itself, the market will adjust itself. This is not true. The market is not self-regulating. It is not a well-tuned ecosystem. Eventually you end up, what's ironic is a lot of libertarians embrace Ayn Rand and Ayn Rand's principles of objectivism, or so they claim, when really they're just hungry capitalists. Now, Ayn Rand was a defender of capitalism, but what you need to understand about objectivism, one of the very important things that Ayn Rand talks about is the role of government is to hold order, okay, to continue to hold order. And Ms. Rand, her point was what always happens is, unfortunately, like the Soviet Union, although I find many positives in the Soviet Union, like Ms. Rand said, whether it's the Soviet Union or she was a big hater of National Socialist Germany, of course, because of her ethnicity. But what happens is you have the mastermind, and the mastermind wages control over the mastermind runs control over the brute, and the brute controls society through strong arm tactics. So what happens is you have the intelligentsia. The intelligentsia then enslaves the minds of basic thuggery, or basic thugs. They hire thugs for police and thugs for law and order, and then the thugs go and they control the masses by removing their rights. And these were the ideas of Ayn Rand. These are the ideas that modern day libertarians, they just do not grasp this. And this has to do with their concepts of large-scale privatization of police forces, military, etc. It does not work out, because when you have a police officer or the military working for the dollar instead of working to serve the public, they will work for the dollar. And that's why people ignore that aspect of objectivism, but yet they claim to be objectivists. There are also a number of Jewish secular organizations at the local, national, and international levels. These organizations often play an important role in the Jewish community. Most of the largest groups. Now, what's funny is the biggest representation of the Jewish people, I believe, in the United States, hands down, is the evangelical community, particularly with respect to Zionism. Like ethnic nationalism, the biggest supporter of Zionism is not the Jewish groups. It's evangelicals, and to some extent, conservative Catholics, which there's not a lot of conservative Catholics, because most Catholics are ridiculously liberal people, okay? Okay, so these organizations, yada, 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 yada. So no one secular group represents the entire Jewish community, and there is often significant internal debate among Jews about stances. Now, this is the thing that you have to understand, too. The Jewish people are not monolithic. There are different sects of Jews, different variances of how, and it varies like any other group of people, individual to individual to individual to individual. It's going to change how much they observe this, how much they observe that, how much they believe in this versus that, how much they do this versus that. So they are not a monolithic people. They are not a monolithic group. People may think they are, and in some respects, certain camps are, but it's not like one big monolith. I would say the evangelicals are far more a monolith. For example, like the pro-life lobbyists are way more monolithic than, say, the Jewish people as a whole, and the Jewish organizations as a whole, because amongst Jewish organizations, you have pro-life organizations, you have pro-choice organizations, you have leftist organizations, you have right-wing organizations. But one of the common themes is cosmopolitanism amongst them. Okay? So every major American city has a local Jewish federation and may have sophisticated community centers and provide services, mainly healthcare related. They raise record sums of money for... Now, what's funny is, what I find interesting about this, people get all creeped out by the Freemasons. Why, I have no idea. What's funny is people do not get creeped out by, like, the Order of Oddfellows or the Elks or the Lions Club or any of these. And for some reason, not the Shriners, because the Shriners are actually an aspect of Masonry. But I don't know, they just don't get so freaked out by the Shriners. But yeah, it's like the Shriners are essentially an Islamic aspect of Masonry, okay, that promotes hospital stuff and helping children with health conditions and whatnot. But you don't see very many people getting freaked out about this. And I don't think it is anything to get freaked out about, but, you know, whatever. So, what about the progressive movement? So, so two girls wearing banners. This is about the abolishment of child slavery. About, you know, the overworking of children in the factories in the North. Now, what's important to understand is it has long been known that the health conditions for the average slave in the South were far, far, far better than the average factory worker in the North. So, with the influx of Jews from Central and Eastern Europe, many members of the Jewish community were attracted to labor and socialist movements, and numerous Jewish newspapers, such as Vorwärts and Morgen Freiheit, had a socialist or communist orientation. Left-wing organizations such as Arbeiterring and the Jewish People's Fraternal Order played an important part in the Jewish community life until World War II. Jewish Americans are involved in many important social movements, being at the forefront of promoting such issues as workers' rights, civil rights, women's rights. So that's all normal. That would be across the board. So what you have to understand is workers' rights, civil rights, and women's rights would have been promoted anywhere that you see progressive policies, whether it's fascist Italy, whether it's the USSR, whether it's National Socialist Germany, whether it's Peronist Argentina. These are all normal things: workers' rights, civil rights, women's rights, as well as freedom of religion. But the concept of gay rights and now trans rights and these things, that's not too normal. For example, you also saw this, the concepts of workers' rights, civil rights, women's rights, and peace movements in the British Union of Fascists. Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, you clearly saw workers' rights, civil rights, freedom of religion, freedom from religion, peace movements, and various quote-unquote left-wing causes were all embodied in Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. But what you are not, so anywhere you see the application of social justice, you will see these, with the exception of things like gay rights. And I'm going to do another video series on academia and how academia, because that's what I'm getting into here. Academia, so it's not just psychiatric medications, it's the philosophy that goes along with it, which comes from this concept of forced social change. Presidential elections, Jews as small-town businessmen were generally conservative Republicans in the late 19th century, but did not mobilize as a separate political faction. The new Yiddish-speaking arrivals in the early 20th century were more radical, and that's the other thing you have to understand. You are going to find a sharp distinction from the German or Western European Jewish person than you are going to find from the Soviet citizen that came here. Okay? Just all around different, because you have different how can I put this? Different business attitudes, different attitudes towards. So what you had is you had German Jewish immigrants that were strict supporters of capitalism, and then you had Yiddish-speaking arrivals from Poland and eastward, which were supporters of, more left-leaning causes. So, in 1920, 38% of Jews voted socialist and 43% voted Republican. According to Beth Wenger, New Dealer Franklin Roosevelt cemented an unbreakable Jewish democratic bond in 1940 and 1944. 90% of Jews voted for Franklin Roosevelt. I don't think Franklin Roosevelt could have really been considered a liberal, though. And 75% voted for Harry S. Truman in 1948. Okay, so, during the Nixon election, so let's see, wait. In 1964, now this is absurd because this is what's odd about this is Barry Goldwater is actually Jewish. So it shows that they're voting for ideology first. So in 1964, 90% of American Jews voted for Lyndon Johnson against the Republican Barry Goldwater. Now, Mr. Goldwater was in fact Jewish. They're saying he was a Protestant with 2 Jewish grandparents. So Mr. Goldwater was a Protestant that had 2 Jewish grandparents, but that shows that they're not voting ethnicity, they're voting ideology. Lyndon Baines Johnson, of course, was aggressively liberal. Far more liberal than his predecessor, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Hubert Humphrey garnered 81% of the Jewish vote in 1968 in his losing bid for president against Richard Nixon. During the Nixon re-election campaign, Jewish voters were relatively apprehensive about George McGovern and only favored the Democrat by 65%, while Nixon then doubled the Jewish support for Republicans to 35%. In the election of 1976, Jewish voters supported the Democrat Jimmy Carter by 71%. So as you can see, this is ideology over the incumbent Gerald Ford. But now what's funny about Jimmy Carter was just an all-round decent person. He still is an all-round decent person. But again, you see voting with ideology. So, Republican, blah, blah, blah. Ronald Reagan garnered 39% and 14% to the independent candidate, da, da, da. During the Reagan re-election campaign of 1984, he retained 31% of the Jewish vote, while 67% went to the Democrat Walter Mondale. In 1988, elections saw Jewish voters favor the Democrat Michael Dukakis, and while George H.W. Bush got 35% of the vote. So 80% voted for Clinton, 9% voted for Ross Perot. The elections, so wow, none of them voted for Mr. Bush. I didn't actually know that. 1%, I guess. The presidential election, this is just going over election history. United States Congress, for congressional and Senate races, American Jews have voted about 70 to 80% for Democrats. This support increased to 87% for Democratic House candidates during the 2006 elections. Currently, there are 10 Jews among the 100 U.S. senators. 9 Democrats: Michael Bennet, Richard Blumenthal, Ben Cardin, Dianne Feinstein, Brian Schatz, Chuck Schumer, Ron Wyden, Jackie Rosen, and John Ossoff. And one of the Senate's 3 independents, Bernie Sanders, who caucuses with the Democrats. During the Civil Rights Movement, American Jews, during the Civil War, American Jews were divided on their views regarding slavery and abolition. Prior to 1861, there were virtually no rabbinical sermons on slavery. The silence on this issue was probably a result of fear that no, it wasn't. It was because Jewish people were prominent slave owners, or at least some of them were. The silence on this issue is probably a result of fear, blah, 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 blah. But what you have to understand is, again, as I said, what you have to remember, at that time, the progressive concepts were predominantly Christian, and at that time were predominantly being taken up by people like the Universalists, the Unitarians, and the Quakers, and various Protestant sects who were, especially from New England, who were very much against this. The abolitionist Ben Wade, who knew Benjamin in the U.S. Senate, described him as an Israelite with Egyptian principles. Northern Jews sympathized with the South, yada, yada, yada. So normal Jews did sympathize with the South. Okay, and very few were abolitionists, seeking peace and remaining silent on the subject of slavery. So keep that in mind. Northern Jews sympathized with the South, and very few were abolitionists, seeking peace and remaining silent on the subject of slavery. Now, what's funny is I actually consider that to be an intelligent stance. Why is that? Because if you note, the Confederate Constitution actually was going to abolish slavery in the future, and I do think that keeping the Republic together as a whole, and not having so many Americans perish unnecessarily, and working it through in a diplomatic and slower manner would have been a much, much, much better way to go about that. America's largest Jewish community is, of course, in New York, and was overwhelmingly pro-Southern, pro-slavery, and anti-Lincoln. So America's largest Jewish community in New York was overwhelmingly pro-slavery, pro-Southern, and anti-Lincoln in the early years of the war. However, eventually they began to lean politically toward Father Abraham in his Republican Party and emancipation. Since the beginning of the 20th century, many American Jews became very active in fighting societal prejudice and discrimination, and have historically been active participants in movements for civil rights including active support of the participation in the civil rights movement, active support of and participation in the labor rights movement, and active support and participation in the women's rights movement. So all of these things you see here, civil rights movement, labor rights movement, women's rights movement, a lot of these were embraced by Christian progressives, particularly Quakers and Adventists. Seymour Siegel suggests that the historic struggle against prejudice faced by Jews led to a natural sympathy for any people confronting discrimination. Joachim Prince, president of the American Jewish Congress, stated the following when he spoke from the podium at the Lincoln Memorial during the famous March on Washington on August 28, 1963. As Jews, we bring to this great demonstration in which thousands of us proudly participate a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of the history. From our Jewish historic experience of 3,500 years, we say our history began with slavery and the yearning for freedom. During the Middle Ages, my people lived for 1,000 years in the ghettos of Europe. It is for these reasons that it is not merely sympathy and compassion for the black people of America that motivates us. It is above all and beyond all such sympathies and emotions, a sense of complete identification and solidarity born of our own painful historic experience. Interestingly enough, as you will see during the Civil War, they did not seem to share that. Okay? And the other thing is, if you read the Old Testament, and a lot of people have, because the South would use it to justify slavery. There is a lot of justification for slavery in the Bible. Okay? International affairs. American Jews and Jews worldwide began taking a special interest in international affairs in the early 20th century, especially regarding their co-religionists' persecutions during pogroms in Imperial Russia. This period was synchronous with the development of political Zionism, as well as the Balfour Declaration, which gave Zionism its first official recognition. During the 1930s, large-scale boycotts of German merchandise were organized. This period was synchronous with a rise of fascism in Europe. Franklin Roosevelt's leftist domestic policies received strong support in the 1930s and 1940s, as did his foreign policies and the subsequent founding of the United Nations. Support for political Zionism in this period, although growing in influence, remained distinctly a minority opinion. The founding of Israel in 1948 made the Middle East a center of attention. The immediate recognition of Israel by the American government was an indication both of its intrinsic support and influence of political Zionism. Okay. In contemporary politics, today American Jews are a distinctive and influential group in the nation's policies. Jeffrey S. Helmreich writes that the ability of American Jews to affect this through political or financial clout is overestimated. And I would actually agree with that. I strongly agree with that, actually. I think that politically and financially, the two main groups influencing U.S. politics are there's three, but the two big ones are evangelical Christians, who happen to have very similar views to the Zionist Jewish people, which is still, I believe, somewhat of a minority amongst the American Jewish people. And also, you have the Catholic Church, that has been working very hard to promote certain policies like a weak border, not encouraging support for a strong border security. They have also been encouraging a lot of third world migration. That's the Catholics, and they have a lot of financial clout. In more local politics, the Vatican, as per different Catholic political lobbies, has worked diligently, and I've shown this in previous videos, to fight any legislation that is anti-sex crime. Okay? And then the third group is the gay lobby. I think that the gay lobby has quite a lot, mainly due to its ideological influence over many pro-homosexual leftists and many pro-homosexual so-called conservatives like Donald Trump. I don't know how many times I've shown that video of Trump Pride. If you don't believe in Trump Pride, Google Trump Pride, Tiffany Trump. Okay, according to a 2017 survey, 54% of Orthodox Jews say they voted for Trump. So 54% of Orthodox Jews voted for Trump. That was well above the 24% of conservative Jews, 10% of Reform Jews, and 8% of Reconstructionist Jews, and 14% of respondents who identify themselves as just Jewish. Jews have devoted themselves to politics with almost religious fervor, writes Mitchell Bard, who adds that Jews have the highest percentage voter turnout of any ethnic group. Okay, so Jews actually have the highest voter turnout of any group. Now imagine if non-Jews turned out to vote as the Jewish people do. While 2 to 2.5% of the United States population is Jewish, 94% live in 13 key electoral college states, which combined have enough electors to elect the president. Okay, so keep that in mind. So if they're turning out in the percentages they are, they have the ability to flip the election through the electoral college due to the states in which they are placed. Though the majority, 60 to 70% of the country's Jews identify as Democratic, Jews do span the political spectrum, and Helmreich describes them as a uniquely swayable bloc as a result of Republican stances on Israel. A paper by Eric Oslaner of the University of Maryland disagrees, at least with regard to the 2004 election. Only 15% of Jews said that Israel was a key voting issue. I would say that there's not really that many that do, because you have a lot of, it's the same thing that you had during the 1960s and so. The majority of Jews in this country are liberal, and they support the concepts of leftism. Zionism, for the most part, is a conservative and nationalistic ideology. Okay? So the paper goes on to point out that negative views of evangelical Christians had a distinctly negative impact for Republicans among Jewish voters. Now, what's funny is American Jewish people have essentially a negative outlook, a negative view of evangelical Christians. What's humorous about that is anybody that has had to spend time and space with evangelical Christians knows that evangelical Christians have nothing but a positive outlook towards the average American Jew, to the point where it has almost become a form of pseudo-worship of the Jewish people. A New York Times article suggests that this movement of Jewish voters to the Republican Party is focused heavily on faith-based issues similar to the Catholic vote. I'm glad somebody brought that up, which is credited for helping President Bush taking Florida in 2004. Now, what you have to understand about La Florida is La Florida has a ton of Cuban refugees and the descendants of Cuban refugees that are ardently conservative, although many of their descendants are shifting left, hard left, because they're Hispanic, okay, and Hispanics tend to vote hard left. Ironically, what you also see in this country, and I think it's a wonderful thing, you see a lot of Hispanics converting to the Mennonite religion and the evangelical religion, and I see that as a wonderful thing because, to be quite honest, as people know my views on the Catholic Church. I consider the Catholic Church to be nothing but an organized, it's a criminal enterprise profiting from the exploitation of children and women, posing as a religion, okay? And I see the Mexicans, particularly the Mexicans and other Hispanics, that come to this country and understand, oh my God, there is a form of Christianity, the Mennonite religion, that actually syncs up with their social views better than the Catholics. And even more importantly, it syncs up with their views on treating people appropriately, because I think what you see a lot with Hispanics in Latin America is they don't know of the various alternative sects of Christianity to Catholicism. And when they come to the United States, they're like, wait a second, you mean there's Christianity that doesn't involve the molestation of children? I'm in. You know what I mean? Which is understandable. I've always had a problem understanding why my mom converted back to Catholicism. When she was a child, her family converted to Presbyterianism, and then later her mother married a member of the Lithuanian Orthodox Church. Now, she did it for her boyfriend at the time's family, but I always found it disturbing that anyone could convert to Catholicism in the United States, okay? Because knowing full well what's going on, and we do, it is highly disturbing to me that anybody could turn a blind eye to what's going on in the Catholic Church and convert to that religion. So that is the thing, is you do have the Catholic vote, and the Catholic vote, like I said, Catholics are a minority in this country. They are not a vast majority in the United States of America. They do, however, own a lot of land, and they have a lot of money, and it's particularly the Vatican and the various archdioceses such and such and such and such that help to control political aspects in local communities and as at large. Now, I'm not against everything with the Catholic Church. One of the most beautiful things, I think, is there's a Catholic church down the street from me that offers alternatives to abortion. Okay, and I've been I've stated for a very long time that if the Republicans were indeed serious about decreasing abortion, what they need to do instead of outlawing abortion, we know that outlawing abortion actually increases the amount of illegal abortions. At one time, Argentina had more abortions per capita than the United States, despite abortion being outlawed there. What the U.S. government needs to do is do what the Soviet Union and National Socialist Germany and a lot of other countries have done, and that is to implement a system of orphanages run by the state and to implement a stronger social safety net for single mothers so that they do not feel pressured to have an abortion, and they do have the ability to give up their child if need be. Okay? I don't believe the foster care system is the healthiest. I do think that state-run facilities to properly raise these children would probably be the best bet. Sort of like, the Fountain of Life program under Heinrich Himmler, or the Soviet system of orphanages. Though critics have charged that Jewish interests were partially responsible for the push to war with Iraq, Jewish Americans were actually more strongly opposed to the war with Iraq. And this is important to understand. Why is this? Well, this is because the people that have these kooky views are again evangelical Christians. How many times have you heard evangelical Christians yammering and yammering and yammering and yammering about how the war with the Arab world is some sort of new crusade? Well, it's not, okay? The problem is because of the shared interests of kooky evangelical Christians and Zionism, people are assuming that American Jews support these things, when really with foreign policy, American Jews are more so non-interventionist in most ways. As noted above, they were even more opposed to than Arab Americans. And so keep that in mind. They were more opposed than Arab Americans to the war with Iraq. The greater opposition to the war is not simply a result of high Democratic identification because you have to remember the war in Iraq was supported by both Democrats and Republicans. It wasn't dropped by Democrats until it started failing, and then they were against it. U.S. Jews, as Jews of all political persuasions, are more likely to oppose the war than non-Jews who share the same political leanings. The widespread Jewish opposition to the war in Iraq is also not simply a matter of the majority of Americans now also opposing the war. And that's the thing, is I'm one of the only people that oppose the war from the get-go. The war, because the majority of Jews already opposed the war in 2003 and 2004, when most Americans did not. Owing to high Democratic identification, 78% of Jews voted Democrat for Obama, 21% Republican for McCain. American Jews are highly supportive of gay rights, okay? Though a split exists within the group. So that's what you have to understand. There is not just a split, there is a continental drift between these two groups. The Reform and Reconstructionist Jews are far more supportive on the issues like gay marriage than Orthodox Jews. Survey of conservative Jewish leaders and activists showed that an overwhelming majority supports gay rabbinical ordination and same-sex marriage. Now, as someone whose grandfather was opposed to the homosexualization of the Episcopal Church, my grandfather was an Episcopal minister and was ardently against the current state of the Episcopal Church being super pro-gay. The thing is, and this was my grandfather's stance if I remember 100%, you can't have somebody preaching the Bible that is openly defying the Bible, can you? Doesn't that seem a little odd that you have somebody preaching adherence to the Bible that is openly defying the Bible? So that's a very important point to consider. So these conservative, so-called conservative Jewish leaders have overwhelmingly supported gay rabbinical ordination. Jews in America also overwhelmingly oppose current United States marijuana policy. 86% of Jewish Americans opposed arresting nonviolent marijuana users, compared to 61% for the population at large. 68% of all Democrats, additionally, 85% of Jews in the United States opposed using federal law enforcement to close patient cooperatives for medical marijuana. Okay. So, Israelis favored Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney over Barack Obama. Okay, so Israelis did in the 2012 United States presidential election by 57 to 22%. Bernie Sanders won the New Hampshire Democratic primary on February 9th, 2016 by 22.4% of the vote, as 60 points below to Hillary's. Sanders, a self-identified democratic socialist, he's a Trotskyist, has repeatedly described himself as a secular Jew. Barry Goldwater, the 1964 presidential nominee, was the first winner of Jewish heritage but was a Christian. In the midterms, Jews were again the most democratic group as designated by religious identity, with 79% voting Democrat. Okay, while 17% voted Republican. Okay, moving forward. When we get back, we're going to talk about Judaism and sociology, the 8 genders in the Talmud, and gender in Jewish studies. Gender and Jewish studies. Okay, and that's all for this video.